Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today is the 5th of October and I want to start out by thanking everybody for 10,000 subs. That's crazy. I never thought I'd actually reach that number, but thanks to all of you who have actually done that. But I'm not stopping with the grind, we're going to continue. And so we have a lot to talk about that I missed over the past 2 days, so I'm going to try to summarize a lot of it, but hopefully I can still give a good explanation of what occurred. So of course I'm going to start out with the Kherson region where I did make a bunch of changes to the map right now. So I'm going to start off by talking about what happened in the northern part of the Kherson region, where we first had the 46th Air Assault Brigade, the 129th Territorial Defense Units, the 63rd Mechanized Brigade, and then some volunteer units, and also the 73rd Maritime Special Operations Center fighting in this area. And they were able to break through, specifically around Olhinia, where you had a lot of fighting over the past month or so. And with this breakthrough, they were able to break through the very tentative Russian line of defense around this road, which was from Ivanivka to around Vysokopilia, this area basically. And so they had to retreat first to the line around Kostyrka and this other town over here. It's called Blaktinia. And so this was the new line of defense for a few hours, but of course this was not a stable line, and a much broader retreat was necessary in order to get the situation under control for Russia, so they had to retreat even farther back. And so in this retreat, whatever VDV units were involved, they had to abandon a lot of major towns that were very important to the Russian line of defense, and that was all around the Inhulets River. So I'm talking about towns such as Starosilia, Novodmitrivka, Velika Oleksandrivka, and then also Mala Oleksandrivka. These were all pretty large towns compared to some of the ones that are more inland. And so all of these have now lost their significance because the fighting is not even centered around the river anymore. Most importantly, Davydiv Brid was captured, and this was a heavily fortified town. For months now, Russia has been pushing back assaults in this area, and now they just gave it up without a fight. And you now have Ukrainians in here. I have a video linked. And the thing that happened with the fall of Davydiv Brid is that the bridgehead around Andrivka has been saved. It won't be quelled. It's now united with a much larger force from the north, and so they can coordinate together to launch assaults over here. And in the bridgehead, you have the 36th and 35th Marine Brigades, and also the 61st Infantry Brigade. So you have a lot of units now that are going to work in tandem, and they could potentially break through even more Russian lines of defense. At the moment, not all of the towns that I have marked as blue are actually under Ukrainian control, because it's going to take them a while to actually enter each one and clear them out. But this is really the new Russian line of defense, and it is centered around this town over here, Milove, and it spans to this other town, Berezhenske. So it's around this road over here, basically, and a lot of these other towns, Ukraine is going to enter them now, and they might have already done so, I'm not even sure, but we don't have visual confirmation. We do know, though, that they have taken Ducheny, which was supposed to be the first line of defense, but this was not sufficient. The Russians, given their lack of manpower, really the only thing they could do once they experienced this major gap in their line was to just retreat as further south as possible, just in order to coalesce around a more narrow front line. Because look at this front line, it was stretching from Zarichny to Osokarivka. Look, it's like about, say, 30 miles or so. That's a pretty large front line, and then their goal is to sort of coalesce it around here, maybe 23. It's not that much of a difference, but it is closer to supply lines, for instance, around Kherson and around Berislav and a lot of these other towns. And it's also pretty close to some of the other units, so they can coordinate with one another, whether it be a lot of the battalion tactical groups that are centered around the major cities. So it was probably the only thing they can do given the tactical situation. And in this area, the two units that I'm aware of that are fighting for the Russians are the 98th VDV Brigade, and then also the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, which was fighting in Olhinia, and then they retreated. So, given that, they're probably around Borozhensk right now, and so you also have a lot of Russian units that were centered around the fighting in the Andriivka bridgehead, including like Kostromka and some of the other towns over here. So now they're closer in contact with the rest of the Russian grouping in Kherson. Anyway, we do have actually a pretty good documentation of a battle that went on around Shevchenkivka a few days ago. And so I have a link to a thread over here that you can look through. Basically, the 73rd Maritime Special Operations Center, they were the unit that took over this town. And so there was a bit of fighting over here. It seems as if the Russians wanted to mount a sort of defense or a fighting retreat, but they were eventually pushed back by the Ukrainian forces. And this was on the road to Ducheny. So it happened a few days ago. Now, I'm sure that the 73rd unit is operating around Milove, and there are probably a bunch of other units that are also there, like the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, which is very good in these higher elevation areas, which are specifically along the coastal region right next to the Dnieper River. And so they're probably operating now around Milove. Milove is certainly a target of the Ukrainians. They want to take it, and then if that were to fall, I would say the next Russian line is around Novokyri over here. There's another road just south of Novokyri, which connects to Stepny and to Chokolove, and a lot of these other towns over here that are inundated with Russian forces and some fortifications that are going to be built now. And so the new line could look like this. And so you will see Ukraine try to break through again in order to prevent a more solid line being built, because by then it might not even be possible to launch the same sort of assaults as we saw them do a few days ago. And those were only possible because of a lack of manpower and a lack of cohesion. So if we see the Russians succeed in that, then they might not be able to advance anymore. But given the fact that the Russians were not able to hold off the initial assaults, they might be lower on equipment now and might have suffered some losses, and their morale might be shaken, and so there is still a window of opportunity for Ukraine to advance. And so we're going to see some continued Ukrainian attacks in this direction over the coming days. Specifically, we saw some attacks in the direction of Ternovy-Pody, and we don't have the results yet for what occurred here, but it was reported that the 59th Mechanized Brigade was fighting in this area. We'll have to see if anything comes of that. I have to say that specifically areas like Oleksandrivka, Pravdinye, Blahodatnye, and Ternovy-Pody, all the southern part of Kherson is much more fortified than the northern parts, but a lot of these troops that were fighting here have been fighting for so long, they might have some sort of fatigue, and so you could see new Ukrainian reinforcements being sent in that might actually be able to break through in certain weak points. And so they're going to have to find those weak points. I'm not exactly sure where that would be, but clearly there's being some coordination because you see this big assault in the north. They might want to try to emulate that in the south, and so in that way they can close in on Kherson. But again, let me remind you, Kherson and Chornobaivka are pretty heavily fortified, and so any head-on assaults on these cities will be very difficult. If Ukraine is to take them, it won't be in a sort of street battle. It will be because Russia decides to abandon it on its own because they see that the tactical situation is not favorable to them. And so Ukraine needs to create those conditions, and then maybe you could see Russia withdraw from the west bank of the Dnieper River. There were rumors that Russia started withdrawing from Snihorivka and some other towns along the front lines like Blahodatne, but again, this might be sort of an information war in order to cause panic within the Russian ranks. So I'm not sure if that actually happened. Snihorivka, if it fell, it would be a big loss to Russia in terms of it being a main node of Russian defense, and it was also supposed to be a springboard for some potential attacks on Mykolaiv, although that's not going to happen right now. But it seems as if, at least in the past 24 hours, there has been less of a Ukrainian advance as they continue to consolidate their gains, and then we will have to see what goes on from there. Let's move on now to the Donetsk front, where there's a minor update. Not too important, but I do have to cover it. So, it seems as if after about a month of fighting on the outskirts of Pesky, the Russians have actually been able to advance a little bit around Pervomaiske. So beforehand, the front lines that I had were around, not there, sorry. It was around here. And Ukraine would just continually assault in this direction with their infantry fighting vehicles from both from Vodyane and from Nivelske, Nitelove, and that was able to hold off any sort of Russian and DPR breakthroughs for a very long time. Ukraine did not break through, but neither did Russia, and so there was just sort of a stalemate for a while. But it seems as if the first Army Corps of the DPR was actually able to advance through these residential areas in Pervomaiske and actually reach the city center, sort of, right around the village council and this kindergarten and secondary school. But again, the fighting here is very slow, and if Pervomaiske were to fall, it wouldn't really do much because first, before any sort of major breakthrough over here, Russia would also need to take Vodyane, which is a pretty long town over here. It's centered around some rivers, some water ponds, these bodies of water or whatever, and also around Nitelove. And so those all need to be taken, and those are also very heavily fortified because of 8 years of fighting around the Donbass. And so it's not going to be an easy task. It's not the same as breaking through around Kherson, where there's basically no fortifications and it's all just plains. But it does give Russia one advantage, which is a good position to actually flank the Ukrainian grouping in Nivelske. And Nivelske is a very small town. I had expected it to fall a while ago, but much to my surprise, it did not, because you actually did have a pretty big Ukrainian grouping in here, and they actually had an artillery centered in here, which was the furthest the artillery could go to actually shell the Donetsk city. Because look, it's only like 7 miles away from the outskirts and then 10 miles from the center, and then it could also be used to, say, shell all of these other districts around here, Alexandrivka, Kreminna, all these other tiny settlements around here. So yes, it is a very good position, and there are some barracks over here that were probably used by the Ukrainians. So Russia, now that they have positions just north of Nivelska, they could probably envelop it from three sides and force Ukraine to retreat, although that might also take a long time because they need to break through all of these bush lines and hedgerows over here. And as we've seen, this is very difficult for Russia in this area because of the trench formations and Ukrainian hit and run tactics around here. But it does not look good for Nivelske. There was an attempted Ukrainian assault on Pesky pretty recently. I'm not exactly sure which day it was, but again, it was pretty futile. So I'm not exactly sure where the line of fighting is right now. I just marked it around here on this hedgerow, but it is, of course, subject to change based on the fluidity, because you could just have some like assaults on this road every single day. So there's not one exact line for the fighting, but it's just around this area. Just know that. But let's move on now to some of the more important parts of the front line, specifically the battle in Kreminna, where I do have a bit of an update. So, the Russian sources that I've been reading reported that the 208th Cossack Regiment of the LPR actually broke through and recaptured Dibrova. This Dibrova, not the other one, which is located over here. But again, there's no real proof of this. I'm not actually that surprised though, because it would make sense for the Russians to try to improve their tactical situation around here, because they are obviously digging in Kreminna. They are not going to abandon it. It's going to be very similar to the Le Mans battle, where there's a lot of fighting on the outskirts, and then maybe Russia potentially abandons it after a long time of fighting. And so Dibrova, if they're able to use this as a forward position, it could take Ukraine a while to actually take it back and then advance on Kreminna, and by then their forces might be exhausted. And so I can see why the Russians would do this, or maybe they were doing some sort of recon operation, and this entire area is just no man's land because it is just isolated around some open fields and forests just to the south of it, and so it's not a very advantageous area to be around. So maybe you just had some Russian forces entering and leaving. It doesn't really matter though. There's also this other town around here, Mijminia, which is just very close to Kreminna. Again, just one of these like sparsely populated settlements that I have marked as red, but that's subject to change based on whatever happens. For now, I'm leaving Dubrova as um, contested, but again, you might see some sort of Ukrainian assault over here. This doesn't mean that Russia is going on the offensive, though. It just means that they want to build some new fortifications that are farther away from Kreminna. They have a lot of their positions in terms of artillery and stuff centered around the cemetery area over here, just to the west of the actual town itself. And so this is an area where you could see some fighting later on. And so we haven't seen many changes in this front over the past few days. Both sides are just starting to redeploy their forces and prepare for the upcoming battles. You do have some reinforcements being sent into the Russian side from the 58th, 20th armies, of course. And so this area is going to be very heavily contested. The civilians were already evacuated from this area. The hospitals were evacuated. The administrative buildings were all evacuated. All of that. The shops were closed. So now this is a completely just militarized city. So you could see total fighting here, total war, no regard for any sort of civilian infrastructure, just because you're going to have a lot of Russian troops stationed throughout the city. And so it's going to be a pretty brutal battle, just like Le Mans, but on another scale, just because now you have more reinforcements for both sides. Now let's move on to the situation around Trekivka, where the 95th Mechanized Brigade was seen over here. They took a photo, so we know their furthest extent is over here, although who knows what happened by now. Maybe they've reached the Zerbets River. So there were rumors that Makivka had fallen, and there's no way to know for sure because the only evidence was a video which showed Ukrainian troops near Makivka. There was some sort of Russian like makeshift fortification which had Makivka spray painted on it. That doesn't really mean that they're in the town, but it does mean that they're in the vicinity of the town, and so you might see some assaults on there later on. It is divided by the Zerbets River, so you might see some sort of assault from the south and from the west at the same time, which could force Russia to retreat further back to Ploshchanka, where the Ukrainians are actually pretty close to Ploshchanka already. And so you might even have to see Russia withdraw from there and just go all the way back to the Krasna River over here. But again, the Zerbets River was abandoned a long time ago. You could see how it was abandoned around Zarichny, so clearly they're not intending to hold the line around Makivka for a long time, given the fact that they barely have any forces in this area. I did hear, though, that the bridge across the Zerbets River was blown up by Russia. I think this is the bridge I was talking about, so the Ukrainians will have to just cross with boats or just build a pontoon bridge. Now, a lot of these towns over here that are along the Oskil River, Russia just withdrew from them without a fight just because they don't have any sort of numerical advantage in this area. They really need to just coalesce around the Svatove line. And so I just have marked all of these towns as blue. You have the Kraken Battalion. It's one of those units that is scouting in this area. They're usually the first ones to enter these towns like Borova or like Bohuslavka. They've also helped enter a lot of the towns around Kupiansk, and so they're very important in that regard. And then you also have, of course, the 92nd, 93rd Brigades fighting in this area, so they're advancing on Kislivka, and I will talk about that in a second. You also have the 14th Brigade. They've tried to break through around Tavluzhanka. They haven't had success just yet because the terrain here is very rugged, and that's a major problem in northern Luhansk, so I'm going to talk about that now. Basically, all this area in northern Luhansk is actually pretty high elevation, and there's a lot of bad terrain, not good for mechanized units, which is why You're seeing most of the advances just south of northern Luhansk, just around like the central area where you have more plains. But the good thing is for the Ukrainians, once they're able to break through around here and force the Russians out of the areas west of Svatove, they will have total control of the high ground. So for this, they need to take Kislivka first of all. They would also need to take, say, all of these other towns over here, specifically Kolomirychivka over here. This is another good position for artillery. And then, of course, Harakivka is another good area for this sort of assault. I would say if they were able to reach sort of like Kovalivka, then that would be even better. But again, all of these towns over here that are about 10 miles away from Svatove, they are very good positions for firing artillery onto Svatove, just given the fact that they're on higher elevation than Svatove. Svatove is centered around a river, and so it's in like a more of a valley area, and so is the highway and all the towns that are around the river, the Krasna River. Most importantly, like Troitske. This is really where the Russian line will start. So that area is higher elevation, but then as you go further south, Svatove is very low elevation, and so you're going to see a lot of shelling over here. One last thing I'm going to talk about is the Russian use of drones, and they launched about 16 of those last night. One of them hit Bilatsverka. It might have been two, I think, according to Ukrainian reports, and these were, of course, the Shahed 136s. They hit the barracks of the 72nd Brigade. I don't get why they're hitting targets so deep into Ukrainian territory when there are so many more important targets that are being used right now in actual important battles going on in Kreminna and Kherson. But yeah, clearly this did some damage to the barracks, and so there might have been some casualties incurred. When I was looking through the Ukrainian reports, the only thing about casualties that I could see was one person injured, but who knows what actually occurred there. There was also one other incident that was reported about drones last night. There was one that was flying around the Mykolaiv region, and that one was apparently shot down around Rybakivka. So that's really it in terms of the drone usage. But again, you're seeing how it's becoming more and more widespread. Russia's using it way more on longer targets, long range targets in Odessa and such. But that's really it for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.